Reading the Times for Saturday, February 22nd, 2020. Russia is said to be interfering to aid Sanders in Democratic primaries. Russia has been trying to intervene in the Democratic primaries to aid Senator Bernie Sanders, according to people familiar with the matter. And Mr. Sanders said on Friday that intelligence officials recently briefed him. At a campaign rally in Las Vegas, Mr. Trump suggested that Mr. Putin would prefer Mr. Sanders, who honeymooned in Moscow. Mr. Sanders and his wife traveled to the Soviet Union in 1988 on a trip that political opponents have called their honeymoon, a term that the couple have jokingly used too. The campaign sought to pin the blame for the disclosure on the Trump administration, suggesting it was retribution for critical remarks Mr. Sanders has made about Mr. Grenell in 2018. Russia also worked to support, or at least not harm, Mr. Sanders in 2016. With 4 deaths in Iran and more cases on 3 continents, fears of coronavirus pandemic rise. The United States now has 34 cases, with more expected, and Italy experienced a spike from 3 cases to 17 and ordered mandatory quarantine measures. We are wondering about the potential for more cases to be exported in the coming days. We want all countries to be aware of this and to put in place detailed measures to pick up these cases as early as possible. Testing is just getting set up around the world. There's barely any in Africa right now. Even in the U.S., we're testing travel cases, but we're not testing in any meaningful way that will pick up cases that we didn't suspect were there. Under O'Brien, NSC carries out Trump's policy, but doesn't develop it. When President Trump's National Security Advisor, Robert C. O'Brien, convenes meetings with top National Security Council officials at the White House, he sometimes opens by distributing printouts of Mr. Trump's latest tweets on the subject at hand. In the years since the National Security Council was started by President Harry S. Truman in 1947, its influence has fluctuated depending on the president, the National Security Advisor, and the relative power of the cabinet members and agency chiefs in the National Security Advisor must coordinate. Shrinking the size of the National Security Council might actually hurt the president's agenda, since it holds departments and agencies accountable for carrying it out, according to Nadia Schadlow, who served as Mr. McMaster's deputy and the principal author of Mr. Trump's national security strategy. At Walgreens, complaints of medication errors go missing. The Oklahoma State Board of Pharmacy released a complaint against a CVS pharmacy in Owasso, a suburb north of Tulsa, regarding a medication error made last year. His mother reported that during one seizure he fell and gashed his forehead. After the mistake was reported to the pharmacy board, an investigator for the state checked 200 prescriptions at the Owasso pharmacy for accuracy and found a 9.5% error rate, according to the complaint. A group called Pharmacist Moms, which says it represents 32,000 female pharmacists, also responded to the article, posting a letter on its website and social media accounts that said, "We feel strongly that patient safety may be compromised due to the overly stressful working conditions at chain pharmacies. Pharmacist Moms!" Nevada is booming, but not everyone is feeling the gains. In South Nevada, median home prices have increased by 40% to $305,000, according to the Las Vegas Realtors Group, and builders now complain they cannot find enough workers. Henderson, like the rest of Nevada, has tried to diversify its economy since the crash to make it less vulnerable to Nevada's boom and bust cycles. Of the more than 141,000 people who moved to Nevada in 2018, about 50,000 of them were from California, the Las Vegas Review-Journal reported, amplifying an eastward flow that goes back decades. Politics of hate takes a toll in Germany well beyond immigrants. The last time Henrietta Reker ran for mayor, she was nearly killed. Given the decentralized nature of Germany's political system, local officials like mayors may be the most important among them. Burkhard Jung, the mayor of Leipzig, another eastern city, said that in his first 9 years as mayor, he did not get a single threat. Countdown begins to possible end of U.S. war in Afghanistan. A week-long reduction in violence across Afghanistan, a major condition for the United States to formally sign its initial peace deal with the Taliban, goes into effect early Saturday, right after midnight. Afghan officials said Friday. Officials hope the process will immediately bring the Afghan government and the Taliban together, then to negotiate a political settlement that would end the insurgency. The only public comment from the U.S. government on the election results hinted at concern on how it could affect the peace process. For Harry and Meghan, no more royal in their brand. Prince Harry and his wife Meghan will give up the name royal as they withdraw from official duties as members of the British royal family and embark on new lives in the private sector, the couple confirmed on Friday. On their website, Harry and Meghan asserted that Buckingham Palace has no legal right to prevent them from using royal outside Britain, but they would do so voluntarily. As part of their severance agreement announced in January, Harry and Meghan said they would no longer accept money from the Soviet sovereign grant, which finances the official activities of the royal family. India set to stage an epic show with Trump as the star. Mr. Modi seems to have enticed Mr. Trump to fly 8,000 miles and spend 2 days in India by his promise to stage a huge, tightly controlled show with Mr. Trump as its center. The Trump family is involved in more real estate projects here than anywhere else outside of North America, and as Mr. Trump showed at the Howdy Modi rally in September, he's eager to court the Indian American vote. Their numbers aren't huge, around 3 million, but they tend to be wealthy and voted overwhelmingly against Mr. Trump 2016. Traveling with the First Lady, Melania Trump, Mr. Trump will tour several Indian cities, including a jaunt to the Taj Mahal. An Egyptian's arrest rekindles an Italian trauma. Beleaguered Egyptian rights activists welcome the Italian clamor as a way of bringing new attention to the growing repression in Egypt, where the security forces' muzzling and mistreatment of the local news media is so commonplace that it rarely makes news abroad. So many of our people have been arrested, it's difficult to keep track of everyone, and said Mohammed Lafti of the Egyptian Commission for Rights and Freedoms. Italy protested harder than most after the death of Mr. Regeni, withdrawing its ambassador from Cairo for 16 months and sending investigators to assist with the Egyptian investigation. In the late 2018, Italian prosecutors said they had identified 5 Egyptians with the National Security Agency who were involved in Mr. Regeni's death. Notre Dame's crypt and square may reopen in the spring. Mr. Gregoire told a group of lawyers and workers would first have to remove lead traces from the site, since levels there and in the cathedral's rubble remain a cause of significant concern. The workers have sorted the rubble under tents set up in the forecourt, strengthening flying buttresses and other damaged parts of the building, and prepared to remove a massive scaffolding that has been set up around the cathedral's roof before the fire to help workers carry out renovation. On the plaza, which has remained open to workers and security employees, many of whom worked without protection in the first few weeks after the fire, lead levels were up to 1,300 times above the French safety guidelines, according to confidential measurements made by the government and obtained by the New York Times in August. Far-right terrorism is number one threat, Germany is told after attack. The Hanau shootings on Wednesday were the latest in a series of far-right attacks at a time when the country's hard-won democratic institutions faced growing distrust, and its usually consensus-driven politics have been fractured by the rise of a right-wing populist party, Alternative for Germany. Horst Seehofer, the Interior Minister, said on Friday that he has ordered increased police patrols on key infrastructure like airports, train stations, and high-profile events such as the Berlin Film Festival in response to the Hanau attack. In Hanau, officials said they would appoint an ombudsman for victims' families who have at times been neglected or worse in previous cases. Iran remains on anti-terrorism blacklist, continuing sanctions. In a separate ruling on Friday, the FATF announced it would keep Pakistan on its gray list, a step above blacklisting, but criticized the country for not doing enough to fight the terrorism financing. The FATF noted that Pakistan had complied with most of the requirement list in the group established in 2018 when Pakistan was put on the gray list at the urging of the United States. After years of shielding Pakistan at the FATF, China and another close ally, Saudi Arabia, uncharacteristically stood aside as the monitoring group deliberated in 2018, leading to Pakistan's placement on that list that is gray. A Kenyan painter casts a critical eye on China's role in Africa. In a separate ruling on Friday, the FATF announced... What the fuck? Oh, shit. I messed that one up. Okay. Kenyan painter casts a critical eye on China's role in Africa. We'll look it up. I'll redo this one. I'll get the right words in there. We'll just have to guess right now. We're going to guess that since America has desire in Africa for our corporate interests, we're going to talk shit about China, who's playing the same game. We're all playing the same game, folks. It's the same fucking game. Thailand court disbands popular opposition party. The Future Forward Party found to have violated a law governing political parties by accepting a loan from its young tycoon leader, Thanathorn Junggrung, to fund an electoral campaign. The Constitutional Courts ruled on Friday has blunted Future Forward's political future, even if its founders said they will simply form another political party. That is an intention to make the Future Forward Party vanish from Thai politics, said Rangsiman Rom, a student activist turned member of parliament for Future Forward. Shadowy church is at the center of coronavirus outbreak in South Korea. Shincheonji members know of their bad image and they usually hide their affiliation from non-church members, even from their parents, said Hwang Eui-jong, a pastor who has researched the church. The church dismissed criticism of its practices on Friday, calling it slandering based on the prejudice among the established churches. It said its members sat close together on the floor because local authorities would not give them permits to build bigger churches. The South Korean news agency Newsies reported on Friday that the Shincheonji had opened a church in Wuhan last year, and that references to it had been removed from the church's website. Ocasio-Cortez builds progressive campaign arm to challenge Democrats. Progressive campaign arm. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on Friday endorsed an all-female slate of progressive candidates through her new political action committee, using her clout in the insurgent left and the considerable campaign funds she had drawn to counter the Democratic establishment in key races around the country. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez has traversed the country to campaign for Mr. Sanders, and her efforts to pull Congress to the left parallel his bid to deploy his progressive message to emerge as a Democratic nominee, an effort that has instilled fear in many centrist lawmakers who believe it could cost them their seats. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez has already announced her support for primary challengers to a pair of her House Democratic colleagues, Mary Newman, who is running against Representative Daniel Lipinski of Illinois, and Jessica Cisneros, who's seeking to oust Representative Henry Quiller of Texas. Could Nevada caucus first in 2024? Harry Reid wants it. As the Democratic presidential candidate as the Democratic presidential candidates plead with Nevadans for their support in 2020, Harry Reid is already looking to 2024. Mr. Reid, the former Democratic leader in the Senate, said in an interview that he hoped that his home state would move to the very front of the primary calendar in the next election. A longtime critic of Iowa and New Hampshire, Mr. Reid engineered an early role for his state starting in the 2008 election cycle, and the significance of Nevada has grown on the Democratic side with each successive campaign. Once one of Mr. Reid's sons had waited in line for an hour and a half to vote early this week, he said, with Mr. Reid's 18-year-old grandson in tow. Biden adds a claim to his biography, an arrest in South Africa. Mr. Biden referred to his own arrest twice more in the next 7 days, including at a campaign stop here on Tuesday, where he spoke of getting arrested in South Africa between efforts to coax his wife to marry him. According to their accounts, Mr. Biden went there after giving Dr. Biden an ultimatum following multiple marriage proposals. Neither Mr. Biden nor Dr. Biden mentioned an arrest when describing the proposal. To this group, labor is more than a white man who works in a factory. Ahead of the 2020 election, the organization's political arm has focused on garnering candidate support for a federal version of a domestic workers' bill of rights, a path to citizenship for domestic workers and their families, and universal child care. Too often, Miss Pooh said it's in the image of a white man who works in a factory or who's a coal worker, not a diverse working class doing service or domestic jobs. Miss Pooh said that is the first time presidential candidates have really been talking about domestic workers since the 1970s, that she is eager for more discussion of what the working class means in 2020. We are writing the DNA of a new economy because really so much of the dynamics that face workers today, domestic workers, have been dealing with forever, she said. Nevada caucuses could be a preview of what's to come. A Las Vegas Review-Journal AARP Nevada poll conducted last week found Mr. Sanders in the lead with 25% of the vote, including about 3/5 of voters under 30 and a third of those identifying as very liberal. A Univision News poll of registered Latino voters put him at 33%, while a Telemundo poll, which focused only on those deemed likely to caucus, gave him 31% support. According to the Review-Journal AARP poll, taken just before early voting began, roughly 3 in 5 Nevadans plan to vote in that window rather than on caucus day. What's at stake in the Nevada caucuses? Wednesday's debate here was the feistiest of the campaign, but its impact on Saturday's results will be limited. More than 75,000 Nevada Democrats had already cast early ballots before the debate began, a figure that is close to the total 2016 caucus turnout. Nobody is sure how many more people will caucus in person. Reliable Nevada polling is scarce, but Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, a top performer in Iowa and New Hampshire, is widely presumed to do well here because of his strength among Latino voters and his organizational advantages in the state. More closely watched is the race for second place. Stay up to date on primaries and caucuses. We'll send you up-to-the-minute results and analyses. He got more delegates than anyone else in the race from the first 2 nominating states. That'll end Saturday if, as expected, Mr. Sanders wins Nevada. The test for Mr. Buttigieg is how he performs in the state's black and Latino neighborhoods. He has a robust on-the-ground political organization and hopes to exceed expectations again. But this is the first time that he's been exposed to a critical mass of voters of color, who polls have shown have been cool to his campaign. If he can't appeal to the Democratic Party's most loyal voting blocs, his days as a top-tier candidate may have come to a close. Everyone says he's expected to win. Other campaigns openly admit they're playing for second. He's got the most money and the biggest organization in Nevada, so anything less than a commanding first-place finish for Mr. Sanders in Nevada would be a disappointment, and threatens to blunt his momentum after a virtual tie in Iowa and a narrow win in New Hampshire. She finally has a breakout debate performance, but it was probably too late to matter in Nevada since early voting closed on Tuesday, the day before. The best-case scenario for Miss Moore is she sneaks into second place and becomes a momentum candidate in the race. Worst case means another fourth-place finish and another failure to break into the race's top tier. She ran a shoestring campaign in Nevada, importing staff from Iowa and New Hampshire just days before the caucuses. Like Mr. Buttigieg, she's shown limited appeal with voters of color, and she's been hammered for forgetting the names of the president of Mexico. In Iowa and New Hampshire, Miss Klobuchar sold herself as a candidate on the rise, someone who beat expectations. Now with higher expectations, the question is whether she can live up to the hype. Her own team said she needs a second-place finish to regain momentum, following dispiriting performances in Iowa and New Hampshire. But like in those two states, Mr. Biden has an inferior organization and has elicited limited excitement from local Democrats. He needs to finally cash in on loyalty and good feelings from Democrats who remember him from the Obama administration. If that doesn't happen in Nevada, South Carolina looms as the last shot for the former frontrunner. The biggest consequence of Nevada's limited polling is nobody knows what to make of Mr. Steyer. Does all his money buy him a constituency? He's been an afterthought in the media, though a Friday night concert with 90s R&B group TLC may buy him some attention on caucus eve. But will it turn out caucus goers for a candidate who hasn't broken out of the low single digits despite also spending an enormous sum in Iowa and New Hampshire? How the Nevada caucuses are supposed to work. Keeping track of the people combine their choices with the early voters and accurately converting those votes into county delegates could prove difficult. If there are 4 candidate groups in the final alignment, each with exactly 25 members, then they each get a quarter of the 8 delegates. 2 delegates per candidate. County delegates are real people, and the precincts can't send fractions of people to the county conventions, so resulting numbers have to be rounded. Bloomberg, in reversal, says he'll release 3 women from non-disclosure agreements. In a statement released Friday afternoon, Mr. Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York, said officials at Bloomberg LP had identified 3 non-disclosure agreements made with women related to complaints about comments they said I made. Mike Bloomberg needs to do a blanket release so that all women who have been muzzled by non-disclosure agreements can step up and tell their side of the story in terms of what Michael Bloomby has done, she told reporters after stopping for a taco as she campaigned across the city. One of the 3 women who's being released from her agreement is Sakiko Sakai Garrison, a former saleswoman at Bloomberg LP, a Bloomby campaign aide said on Friday. Nevada Democrats demand that caucus site leaders sign non-disclosure agreements. The hotline report will be the primary source of the precinct caucus results reported on caucus day. Ms. Mounts wrote, after the precinct caucuses conclude, the precinct chairs will call a hotline to securely report the results to a trained operator. Will submit via text a photo of their caucus reporting sheet to the state party staff through an established MMS reporting hub, and then they will return their caucus reporting sheet and other materials to their site lead, Ms. Mounts wrote. If there are any math questions or other issues on caucus reporting sheets, they will be addressed subsequent to caucus day, she wrote. Black and Latino voters are looking for more than just some token words. The people being wooed most aggressively by Democratic candidates at the moment, Latino voters in Nevada and black voters in South Carolina, are essential to victory in both states, where white voters make up less than half of the Democratic electorate. In South Carolina, the word rigged came up several times as black voters contemplate the remaining options, expressing sadness that black candidates had been forced out by financial woes and poor poll results before South Carolinians had a chance to cast their vote. In Nevada, Latino voters said they were resigned to mostly superficial talk about race for the foreseeable future and expressed resentment that candidates were relatively slow to focus on crafting an appeal to them. As Trump seizes wall money, Congress's spending power weakens. The howls of protests are unlikely to amount to much in a Congress where lawmakers, many of whom once prized their spending prerogatives almost above all else, acknowledge their power to steer federal dollars, has been severely eroded. A Congress appropriation power, which is pretty much the last unchallenged power that Congress has very significantly eroded, said Sean Q. Kelly, a professor of political science, California State University, Channel Islands. While the Senate acquitted Mr. Trump this month of impeachment charges stemming from his decision to withhold military funding from Ukraine, the Government Accountability Office, a nonpartisan federal watchdog, found that Mr. Trump's actions violated the Impoundment Control Act, which limits a president's ability to refuse to spend money allocated by Congress. Trump dismisses warning of Russia 2020 meddling as a Democratic hoax. President Trump said on Friday that a disclosure by American intelligence officials that Russia was again meddling in a presidential election in his favor were merely another partisan campaign against him, dismissing warning as a hoax cooked up by rivals. Hoax number 7. Donald J. Trump, February 21st, 2020, the intelligence assessment delivered last Thursday to lawmakers on the House Intelligence Committee determined that Russia is planning to interfere in the 2020 primaries as well as the general election. Mr. Trump, with the assistance of his Justice Department, has moved to retaliate against the intelligence community rather than Mr. Putin. A federal prosecutor is scrutinizing how the intelligence officials assessed Russia's 2016 election interference, targeting the former CIA director, John O. Brennan, in particular. Richard Grenell begins overhauling intelligence office, prompting fears of partisanship. Richard Grenell's tenure as the nation's top intelligence official may be short-lived, but he wasted no time this week, starting to shape his team of advisors, ousting his office's number 2 official, a longtime intelligence officer, and bringing in an expert on Trump conspiracy theories to help lead the agency. According to officials, Mr. Grenell has also requested the intelligence behind the classified briefing last week before the House Intelligence Committee, where officials told lawmakers that Russia was interfering in November's presidential election, and that President Vladimir V. Putin of Russia favored President Trump's re-election. Intelligence officials have already documented instances of the Kremlin trying to influence American politics, namely attempts by Russian military intelligence officers to hack into the Ukrainian energy company that once employed the son of former Vice President Joseph Biden Jr. Officials want to know whether the breach was an effort to help Mr. Trump, whose efforts to persuade Ukraine to announce investigations into Mr. Biden helped prompt his impeachment. Uniting Trumpers, Never Trumpers, and Democrats with a new deputy at the State Department, which gave rise to some crucial questions. How had Mr. Baigyon navigated Trump world to land such a senior position? Number 2 at the State Department. Could he calm a simmering revolt among career State Department employees who have accused Mr. Baigyon, immediate boss, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, of abandoning veteran diplomats and letting the president's personal political agenda infect foreign policy? Colleagues say the secret to Mr. Baigyon's success so far is that he gained the trust of Mr. Trump by enabling the president's romance with Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader. Officials say the president twice considered appointing Mr. Baigyon as national security advisor, but made him the chief envoy to North Korea instead. In that job, Mr. Baigyon has tried to move talks between Mr. Trump and Mr. Kim forward when other administration officials wanted to shut them down. White supremacists guilty of killing 2 who came to aid of black teens. We started running. Miss Muhammad testified last month in the murder trial of Mr. Christian, an avowed white supremacist. In his murder trial, the woman testified that Mr. Christian had been shouting epithets on the train, and she asked him to lower his voice. even if you decide that he's a white supremacist or a bigot or just a big jerk. Greg Scholl, a lawyer, told Mr. Christian during the jury. That doesn't mean he committed all the crimes he's accused of. The issue is not the legality of racism. In case on wealth test for green cards, a scathing Sotomayor decision. The court's brief order included no reasons for lifting a preliminary injunction that had blocked the new program. The new order drew a scathing dissent from Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who said the Trump administration had become too quick to run to the Supreme Court after interim losses in the lower courts. Two members of the court, Justice Neil M. Gorsuch, joined by Justice Clarence Thomas, issued a concurrence last month's case indicating that the central problem was the geographic scope of the injunction. Microbes point the way to shipwrecks. There's more than meets the eye when it comes to the shipwrecks and others. Researchers have now shown distinct assemblages of microbes inhabit the seafloor surrounding these structures, helping to turn shipwreck sites into artificial reefs rich in life. Dr. Hamden's study and doing experiments on the seafloor to investigate where the microbes came from and where they go when they leave shipwrecks. In the future, Dr. Hamden and his colleagues plan to study microbial communities around other shipwrecks. Florida's voting rights fight could tip the 2020 election. Florida voters will get to decide on ballot referendums that they would restore the voting rights to felons who have done their time. Murderers and sex offenders are excluded. To pass Amendment 4, voters would need 60% or more in November. Vote yes in November to restore voting rights. A state violates that guarantee, the Supreme Court has held, whenever it makes the affluence of the voter a payment of any fee an electoral standard. Florida may disenfranchise all of its felons if it chooses to, but once it restores the right to vote, as it did in 2018, it can't condition the exercise of that right on a voter's wealth. Republicans will continue to practice the dark arts of voter suppression as long as they can, secure in the belief that when the number of voters go down, their electoral prospects go up, until they don't. Where might Trumpism take us? Mickey notes how the Farmers Alliance and Populist Party clashed with state and national Democratic parties on major economic issues, including debt relief for farmers and the regulation of business. What's more, a colored Farmers Alliance grew rapidly as well and held out the possibility of biracial coalition building. That possibility became a reality in states like Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, where populists joined with major black Southern Republican Party to support a common list of candidates and fusion agreements against an explicitly elitist and white supremacist Democratic Party. Working through the Democratic Party, conservative elites repressed populists, seized control of the state apparatus, and effectively ended credible partisan competition. They rewrote state constitution to end the vote for blacks, as well as substantially restricted it for whites. What is the state? Asked one prominent lawyer during Louisiana's 1898 Jim Crow Constitutional Convention, aptly capturing the dynamic at work. It is a Democratic Party. Statehood was conflated with party, writes Mickey, and party disloyalty was state treason. The Democrats are in trouble. I've been enthusiastic about Mike Bloomberg's race for president from its inception, partly on the theory that he was best positioned to rescue and represent the Democratic Party's moderate wing. The second part is that Bloomberg's effect on Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, and Amy Klobuchar, his fellow moderates in the field. For the rest of us, that is, those of us who want Trump and Trumpism defeated and replaced by something considerably and sustainably better, the prospect of a Sanders candidacy is doubly depressing. Donald Trump is going to India to find himself. On his first visit to India next week, Mr. Trump claims he has been promised a welcoming crowd of 10 million people by the country's Hindu supremacist Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. Last September, at a rock concert-like rally at a Houston football stadium, Mr. Modi and Mr. Trump walked hand in hand, the two stocky strongmen looking like brothers in arms. Charges of murder and kidnapping have long pursued Amit Shah, Mr. Modi's closest confidant and India's home minister, but the judge in his case mysteriously died soon after Mr. Modi became prime minister in 2014, and the next judge swiftly acquitted Mr. Shah. Mr. Trump has been forced to bypass Congress to push his measures against immigrants and Muslims, traveling along India for a book on small towns. 3 years after India's economic liberalization started in 1991, I was astonished by how quickly self-perceptions were changing among many middle-class and upper-caste Indians. Can the military fix base housing? According to congressional demands, the Department of Defense must report back by March 1st on which of the 14 contracts failed to comply with the changes to the Public-Private Partnership Agreement in the NDAA. Congress's attention to military housing is promising for military families. A preliminary report from the Government Accountability Office on the condition of privatized military housing found that the Defense Department was at fault on many levels. Performance metrics were insufficient, oversight of physical housing conditions was limited, data on housing maintenance was unsatisfactory, and the department's reporting to Congress was misleading. Privatized military housing needs to be remedied, and so too does the department's oversight of housing for its most precious commodity, service members. Fear about coronavirus in the U.S. and abroad. The World Health Organization characterizing it as a very grave threat globally serves only to trigger even more fear-mongering. COVID-19 might never establish itself in the United States beyond a handful of cases, but public health leaders and infectious disease experts are worrying about the prospect of a novel infection with ill-defined complication risks, one that raises a possibility of numerous deaths and a serious strain on our health system. For pandemic prevention, we must support public health funding and international cooperation. Roger Stone's sentencing. What's wrong with this picture? On Friday's front page is a photo with the caption, Roger J. Stone, Jr., convicted of lying to protect the president, arriving for sentencing Thursday. Mr. Stone and his companion are smiling. What kind of political environment are we living in when it's viewed as a tactical error by the intelligence community to present to the House Intelligence Committee the conclusion that Russia's meddling again to benefit President Trump? Republicans are clearly so afraid of Mr. Trump, they want nothing to do with information they feel feeds into his insecurity about the legitimacy of his 2016 election. Republican members of the House Intelligence Committee have an obligation to review all information with an eye to wherever the truth leads them, not with an eye to how Mr. Trump will react. In sight, the New York City bodegas going viral on TikTok. The video has been viewed more than 5 million times on the video sharing platform TikTok, elevating the profile of the clerk, Ahmed Alwan, and bodega culture itself. It's no longer necessary to live in New York to get a feel for the city's bodegas, thanks to Mr. Alwan and others who use TikTok to post funny video clips that highlight the store's distinctive culture. In a nod to the store's significance to life in the city, comedians Jesus Nice and the Kid Mero, who are now known for the late night show on Showtime, started a podcast called Bodega Boys in 2015. Part pantries, part community centers, bodegas are typically found in New York's working-class neighborhoods. Why a New Jersey political ritual got a Me Too makeover. In addition to instituting new rules for the trip to Washington, intended to give participants the opportunity to meet with and lobby New Jersey's congressional delegation, the State Chamber of Commerce has teamed with New Jersey Coalition Against Sexual Assault to begin holding training sessions for private companies to combat workplace harassment. Women are now willing to be the face of that behavior and to talk about it, said Representative Bonnie Watson Coleman, a Democrat who represents Central New Jersey and served 8 terms as a state assembly before being elected to Congress. Several recent incidents had drawn new attention to the issue, including a new report in December by the Star-Ledger that detailed claims of abuse, assault, and rape by 20 women who work in fields related to politics, most of whom were not identified by name. Who's your train daddy? On Byford's last day, NY leaves no doubt. Mr. Byford announced his resignation 4 weeks ago, dismaying many workers and riders, and ending a 2-year tenure marked by repeated conflicts with Governor Andrew M. Cuomo, who controls the subway and recruited Mr. Byford to New York. Is there any work being done in New York City Transit at the moment? Mr. Byford said to the hundreds of workers who had filled the lobby at the Manhattan headquarters of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. Is there any work, he said, is there any work being done at New York City Transit at the moment? Mr. Byford said to the hundreds of workers who had filled the lobby at the Manhattan headquarters of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, which runs the subway. Mr. Byford said in an interview on Friday that when he took the job, he had hoped to lead City Transit, the division that oversees subways and buses, for 5 years or even 10 years. Still, despite Mr. Byford's accomplishments, the subway remains far from the kind of modern system vital to New York's future. Harvey Weinstein trial. Jury suggests it is split on two most serious charges. The jury in Harvey Weinstein's rape trial sent a note to judge on Friday afternoon suggesting it was deadlocked on the most serious charges in the indictment, but that it might reach a verdict on 3 other counts. The predatory sexual assault could require prosecutors to prove that Mr. Weinstein committed a serious sexual felony against at least 2 people. The case against Mr. Weinstein, 67, was built primarily on the accusation brought by 2 women, Miriam Haley, 42, a former production assistant who testified that Mr. Weinstein forced oral sex on her in 2006, and Jessica Mann, 34, an actress who said Mr. Weinstein raped her in a Midtown Manhattan hotel room in 2013. In weighing the predatory sexual assault charges, the jury was also asked to consider testimony given by the actress Annabella Sciorra, who said Mr. Weinstein raped her in early 1990s. What the jury's note could mean for the Weinstein deliberations. To prove the predatory sexual assault charges, prosecutors introduced the testimony of a third accuser, Annabella Sciorra, an actress from The Sopranos who claimed that Mr. Weinstein raped her at her Gramercy Park apartment in the winter months of 1993 and 1994. One of the predatory sexual assault charges is based on the combined accounts of Miss Mann and Miss Sciorra. The other is based on the combined accounts of Miss Haley and Miss Sciorra. Technically speaking, the jurors could not be deadlocked on the higher charge of predatory sexual assault without having first decided that Mr. Weinstein was guilty of a lower charge, legal experts said. Said a different way, if the jurors have decided to acquit Mr. Weinstein on the charges involving Miss Mann and Miss Haley, they would not need to continue deliberating on the charges involving Miss Sciorra. Fresh Direct, after broken eggs and angry customers, stages a comeback. At the height of the crisis, Fresh Direct's chief executive, Jason Ackerman, stepped down and was replaced by David McInerney, who had helped run the company since early 2000s. At the moment, Fresh Direct delivers to New York, New Jersey, and Washington, D.C., as well as some parts of Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Before becoming chief executive, Mr. McInerney served as Fresh Direct's chief food adventurer, traveling widely with a team of food merchants to scout new products. Federal prosecutors investigating whether Boeing pilot lied to FAA. In recent months, prosecutors had questioned several Boeing employees in front of the federal grand jury, with some of their queries focusing on whether Mark Faulkner, a top pilot at the company, intentionally lied to regulators about the nature of a new flight control software on the jet, people said. The company could also be held liable for potential wrongdoing by Mr. Faulkner because he was a senior employee responsible for Boeing's interaction with the FAA group that determined the kind of training pilots would need before flying the MAX. Last year, the company made public an instant message chat between Mr. Faulkner and his colleague Patrick Gustafson. In grand jury's testimony, in recent months, prosecutors asked the Boeing employees an array of questions, but kept returning to the issue on whether Mr. Faulkner had lied to the agency about MCAS. "We are cooperating with the Justice Department's investigations," a Boeing spokesman, Gordon John Rowe, said in a statement. The liberal economist behind the wealth tax debate. Felicia Wong, the president of the Roosevelt Institute, a progressive think tank, said Mr. Saiz and Mr. Zuckman had helped bring large tax increases on the rich into mainstream, winning support even from Democratic candidates who do not support their wealth tax, while candidates like Mr. Sanders support raising taxes on wealthy by citing Mr. Zuckman and Mr. Saez's claim that the rich pay lower effective tax rates than the poor and middle-class Americans. Many liberal economists say the claim is wrong, since the calculations do not include some tax benefits for poor, like earned income tax credit. Leaving them out seems both analytically and politically mistaken, said Jaron Bernstein, a former top economist for Mr. Obama, who counts himself a fan of Mr. Zuckman and Mr. Saez. Some economists have long been critical of Mr. Saez and Mr. Zuckman's work, including Wojciech Kupchuk, a Columbia University economist who published a rebuttal to the pair's wealth data in 2015. The price of Wells Fargo fake account scandal grows by $3 billion. Wells Fargo has agreed to pay $3 billion to settle criminal charges and a civil action stemming from its widespread mistreatment of customers in the community bank over a 14-year period, the Justice Department announced on Friday. The practices for which Wells Fargo is being punished in the current deal, which includes an admission by the bank that it falsified banking records, are not the only misbehavior the bank has revealed since 2016. One of them, Carrie L. Tolstead, a Wells Fargo former head of retail banking, faces a $25 million fine. Coronavirus outbreak deepens its toll on global business. A huge portion of the world's electronics come out of China's factories, filled with parts also made in China's factories, and longer suspension of production could hit overall supply. The French government said it would urge companies to review their over-dependence on China for raw materials and parts as outbreak exposes weakness among the French manufacturers that have outsourced their supply chains there. On Thursday, the People's Bank of China said it lowered the one-year loan prime rate to 4.05%. from 4.15% and slashed the 5-year loan rate to 4.75% from 4.8%. Now is the time. A Fed official urges Congress to plan for recessions. Monetary policy remains a powerful tool for fighting downturns, and officials plan to use mass bond buying and promises to keep rates low for longer to make up for their lost room to cut rates. Ms. Brainard did not endorse any specific set of policies, but pointed out that while monetary policy is powerful but blunt, fiscal policy can be used to tackle precise problems, important when a big share of households have low liquid savings and are particularly vulnerable to periods of unemployment or underemployment. The group wrote that monetary policymakers should be humble about how much can be expected from new monetary policy tools. What happened between E. Jean Carroll and Elle magazine? In the fall of 2017, when Nina Garcia, the fashion editor and Project Runway judge, became editor-in-chief of Elle magazine, E. Jean Carroll felt she needed to fight for her job. Miss Carroll, 76, was contacted by an Hearst editor, Erin Hobday, who asked if she was free to take a call. Miss Carroll thought she was being invited to the company holiday party. More than a dozen current and former Hearst employees who spoke to the Times anonymously for fear that they would face repercussion in their jobs attributed Miss Carroll's contract termination, at least in part, to a steep paycheck and break in convention. Miss Carroll had given away the news-breaking excerpt from her book to New York Magazine, not Elle. Some said that Miss Carroll's contention that Mr. Trump's insults cost her the columnist's job was self-serving, since her defamation lawsuit against him will require her to prove that she has been damaged by his remarks. Conde Nast to limit the use of NDAs. Conde Nast, the publishing giant behind Vogue, The New Yorker, and Vanity Fair, said on Friday it would no longer use non-disclosure agreements for matters involving harassment and discrimination. The New Yorker has been at the forefront of the discussion. The magazine won a Pulitzer Prize in 2018 for Ronan Farrow's investigation into the decades of allegations of sexual misconduct by the film producer Harvey Weinstein, which involved the use of non-disclosure agreements to silence his accusers. Senator Elizabeth Warren criticized Michael Bloomberg for the use of non-disclosure agreements as his company, Bloomberg LP. Mr. Bloomberg has refused to release some female former employees from agreements they signed after their accusations of harassment and discrimination. Don't let the wrong state get between you and your assets. Generally, exceptions are made in the cases of alimony or child support, but states that allow self-settled trusts, in which the people setting them up are also the beneficiaries, have been challenged for not validating those support exceptions, particularly when the beneficiary lives in a different state. If you happen to live in a state with special asset protection laws, there's nothing stopping you from taking advantage of your own state laws, said Justin Miller, national wealth strategist at BNY Mellon. The real question is whether individuals can set up a trust for themselves in a state where they don't live and still avoid their own state's laws. Will your state respect it? Got an unexpected check in the mail? It may be fake. While federal rules require that banks make funds available quickly for withdrawal, usually a day or two, depending on the type of check, there can be a delay of several days or even weeks before a check is fully verified. Customers are responsible for bounce checks because they are generally in the best position to evaluate whether a check they deposit is legitimate, said Nessa Feta, Senior Vice President at the American Bankers Association. Make sure the check was issued by a legitimate bank. You can check an institution's name on the FDIC's bank find tool. And that has been Reading the Times for Saturday, February 22nd, 2020.